Welcome everyone to our panel. Our chat today is on application and monetization of data. Thank you all for joining the day in its entirety, and thank you to our panelists for joining and sharing their time and insights here. We've got Kristen Holmes, the Vice President of Performance Science at Whoop. She was an All-American field hockey player at Iowa, a member of the U.S. national team, head coach at Princeton, where she won 12 Ivy League titles in 13 seasons, including a national championship. Then we've got David Foster, the Deputy General Counsel of the National Basketball Players Association. He's a graduate of Fordham Law who spent 11 years as a prosecutor, roughly half and half with the Queens County District Attorney's Office and the U.S. Attorney for the District of New Jersey. He was a 400-meter hurdler at Princeton, and according to his bio, does some Ironman races these days, so good for you. And then we've got Mike Weinstein, the CEO and owner of Zybex Sports. He's a graduate of Colorado State and an MBA from the University of Denver. His technology has been powering the NFL Scouting Combine's official data collection for a number of years now. So thanks to all of you for coming. And I think we'll start with that first word, application. We certainly have no shortage of devices that collect data these days, but the real secret sauce, of course, is how you take that and put it into action. So Kristen, maybe we'll start with you. When you're working with a new or prospective client at Whoop, an athlete, what's your first piece of advice? What are the metrics that you can really apply and make some headway early?
I think principally you want to start with only monitoring what you can action. I think having just a notion of data is usually is not super helpful, but if you know exactly what you're monitoring, why you're monitoring it, I think that's kind of the first place to start. So making sure athletes understand, in our case, we're measuring cardiovascular load, we're measuring your capacity to take on load, which is recovery, and we're monitoring sleep. And we see those three as really the foundation of human performance. So helping an athlete understand, what pieces of data within in each side of those pillars to focus on is kind of the place to start. So that's kind of how we begin the conversation.
Mm-hmm. And then, Mike, when you're, I know you started doing some events again recently. Things are opening back up a little bit. When you bring your technology to a site to do, obviously, for those who don't know, in addition to the Scouting Combine, you do a number of events with high schools and colleges. And your big thing is the SAT, the Standardized Athletic Test. What are you telling the athletes who are taking your test? What are they looking for, and how do you think they can apply that data?
Well, the athletes that we're working with really want to progress their career or get into a college or even make the team at a high school level. And what we're really showing them through the work we've done with the NFL for the last 10 years is kind of what an elite athlete looks like in very, very pedestrian terms, how fast they can run 40 yards. And so what we do is we test the athletes in the exact same way that we've tested over 20,000 athletes last year. And we can just show the athletes by position, by age, even where they're at athletically right now and where they need to be by next year. And maybe if they make it all the way to the NFL, really what good numbers are at the NFL and kind of how to get there and what their really target numbers should be, because it's all standard. The exact same thing that we've done at the NFL Combine, we've done at the Army National Combine, we've done to over 100,000 athletes over the last 5 or 6 years. So it's just like taking the academic tests. It's the same test everybody takes over across the nation. This is what we're doing athletically.
Mm-hmm. And David, for those who don't know, you have oversight over the wearables committee, and you do a lot of work trying to vet what that make sure that these technologies are doing what they say they are, and then working with the athletes to on what they should be using. What kind of advice do you provide to the athletes of before they start using the device?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for being here. Thanks for inviting me. One of the main things that we try and tell all the athletes is that if you're going to use a device, or if if a team is going to use a device and capture your data, is to make sure you get a copy of the data, right? Which sounds kind of obvious, but every once in a while you want to remind players that it's your data, and as much as you want to rely on the team, you should make the effort to educate yourself on what's being collected, how it's going to be used, and primarily for two purposes. One, I think that if you understand what's being collected and how it can be analyzed, you can empower yourself to improve the skills you need to improve. And then two, also to double check what's being done by the team. I mean, we all like I believe that the teams hire the best of the best, and that their goal is to help players return from injury faster, fitter, stronger, and to lengthen their careers. But you still want to make sure that the data that's being captured aligns correctly with the information and the workouts that you're being given. So I always tell them, just like, this is like any other part of your profession. You should pay attention. You should be involved. And then obviously, if they have any questions, they should call the union whenever they can.
Mm-hmm. And there's a unique case study in that you just the NBA and NBA Players Association worked together to bring the Oura Ring to NBA players who can choose to opt into wearing it. You know, the season's starting tomorrow. What was that process like in working with the players on a device that can help potentially identify a few symptoms that might flag them for a risk of COVID infection?
Yeah, well, that came to us. I think that we in a way stumbled upon some research that made some early suggestions that the ring might be able to detect early signs of COVID. And so given the bubble restart, given how that was the major concern, we figured that why not add that to the many safety protocols, the health and safety measures that we were implementing. So that didn't replace anything. That's not the number one thing that's used. It's not even a mandatory device that's being used. We just thought, well, look, it might work. The upside greatly outweighs the downside. Let's give it a try. And so that's exactly what we're doing. Normally, we are a lot more, I say, tempered in our introduction of new devices to our athletes. But I think we took a different approach this time because it was a unique situation whereas normally we would go through the wearables committee and there would be a lengthy testing process that goes through that's essentially a year. This, we changed it slightly, but once again, the emphasis was more on the COVID detection possibilities and not necessarily the traditional use of the ring. But we are happy to see if it can help.
And Christian, I know Whoop has had a similar partnership being distributed to PGA Tour players. You know, take us through the process of the distribution of that. Certainly had a pretty high profile case. I believe it was Nick Watney was the golfer who, but yeah, you know it better than I do. Why don't you take us through that?
We have external validation. We're actually the only wearable on the market that has respiratory rate validated by a third party. And respiratory rate has really emerged as kind of the canary in the coal mine when you have structural changes in your pulmonary system that's consistent with COVID, and respiratory rate is a marker that will basically surface. So it's a very stable metric generally. So over the course of a year, your respiratory rate is not going to change. But in the presence of COVID, your respiratory rate kind of jumps off the map. So it's a really good indication that something pulmonary is going on, which is exactly what COVID is. So what happened with Nick Watney is he actually tested negative, and then on like a Tuesday, and the tournament was ready to start on Thursday. He woke up, I believe, Thursday morning, and after just testing negative 2 days prior, woke up Thursday morning, had an elevated respiratory rate. Saw his data inside the Whoop app, and I self-isolated, got tested, and ended up testing positive. So that spread like wildfire through the PGA, and that's when our founder, CEO, Will Ahmed began. He was in conversations with the PGA prior, but that just kind of accelerated things, and we got a partnership in place where we were able to blanket the PGA and now the LPGA with Whoop, with this same sort of concept as David outlined. It's not the only thing. There's other measures in place, but it does provide another layer of protection and hopefully prevention with being able to capture some of these cases that will be missed if you're not testing every single day, which obviously is not a viable solution. I think the other piece too is just generally, I think the big piece of COVID, and it's a little off topic, but is just this, this concept of building resilience, right? It's prevention. It's helping folks understand, the metrics that are important to be aware of and to track. If you're a professional athlete, these are things you need to be aware of. You need to be aware of your sleep. You need to be aware of, how you're managing load and volume and how your body's adapting, and having some insight to that is going to help you position yourself to be less vulnerable to any sickness or any disease that's out there. So I think just in principle that the concept of resilience, as that first layer, and then obviously the second layer being the ability to capture and detect some of these edge cases.
Mm-hmm. Great. And of course, independent of the current pandemic, there's great value in the data for tracking both an individual athlete, but also in the aggregate. So Mike, when you've tested, I think you said over 100,000 athletes in all. When you have, say, a high school senior who wants to get a college scholarship, he goes through one of your tests. What's the value proposition you're offering to this young man as to small incremental areas where he can make big gains? Where can the data show some real potential?
Exactly. That's really where we're monetizing the data for the athlete. For every athlete, the data is more of a marketing tool as much as a self-development. And so, like for the high school athlete, for example, I'll show them exactly what, say, a Division I defensive lineman is from a performance perspective. I'll show how fast the defensive lineman can run 10, 20, 40 yards. I'll show how high he can jump, how far he can jump, and how he can do the pro agility test. And then we'll overlay that with how we measure that high school athlete. And thereby we can really show the athlete exactly where he's at right now and what they need to focus on to hopefully earn that D1 spot at a college, and then maybe professionals and beyond. And on the other side of that, where the coaches are really using the data, their job depends on getting the best athletes for their team. Coaches can teach skills to athletes, but it's really kind of hard to teach someone to be an athlete. That's all we're doing with this here. It doesn't say whether you can catch a ball or make a tackle, but it's showing what your athletic capability is on a very pedestrian level. And so that's how coaches are essentially monetizing the data, because they're going to keep their job if they can win more games. And that's how athletes, whether they're at the high school level or all the way up to professionals, can use this data to help better market themselves. Look at anybody at the NFL Combine, and they got really good 40-yard dash numbers, and that's what they're bragging about. That's what they're talking to. Like fractions of a second can make some differences in starting salary sometimes. So, whether it really does translate to gameplay, that's a totally another discussion. But you can definitely monetize that, and you can definitely optimize that to kind of build your future to get you where you want to be.
Mm-hmm. And so, David, when your players are certainly working with significant salaries, and there's a great amount of value at stake, and certainly with some of these training devices, you can possibly find. To me, it's always seemed like a little bit of a zero-sum game, where you might show that a few players have some hidden talent that maybe earlier today Dr. Elliott was talking about the P3 testing, and it turns out James Harden has this, phenomenal ability to decelerate. His braking system is what sets him apart, and that's a way for, that he's found a lot of success. But certainly there will be other athletes where, maybe there's an underlying susceptibility to an injury. So how do you sort of balance the pros and cons while working through these decisions with athletes?
Well, yes, it is technically a zero-sum game, but we have to look at it from that perspective, and also from each individual athlete, right? Where it's clearly not zero-sum; it could just be zero if numbers don't work out for you. But to me, I think that what is more the access to information and true understanding of what all these numbers mean. So, for example, the data about James Harden and potentially his unbelievable stopping ability, right? I don't have the study, I don't have the records or anything like that. That sounds great, But for it to really be used, you'd have to dig into it a lot more. Exactly how does that benefit a player? How is he tested compared to everybody else? And so until I think there is a more robust investigation into not necessarily the accuracy of devices, but the use of the information, I think that's really the stumbling block, because right now we don't want any player to be adversely impacted because of data that, assume it's accurate, shows something that actually is relatively irrelevant in our sport, right? So there are lots of things that are nice and they're interesting, right? I think that's why this sports techie, that's why I think this industry exists, is because it captures interest from fans, from athletes. Like it's cool. What's the information? People like graphs and speed and charts, and it draws you in. But after you get past that, you need to figure out, okay, how does this actually impact the play on the court, on the field? And so for us, we're still in that phase, right? That's why both committee. That's why we are constantly encouraging the teams to make sure they have the best people to analyze the data. We're constantly pushing the data companies to make sure that they're reporting accurate data. We know we can't control the metrics that they're going to spit out or try and provide us, but at least we can say whatever you're going to give us, it has to be accurate. Then it's up to us and the players and the teams to figure out, does it really make a difference?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of the give and take there.
For sure. And so, Christian, as someone who works for one of these data companies, I know Whoop has always been very outspoken about its, athlete first, that their ownership of the data. But when it does come to the possibility of working with a performance coach, strength and conditioning coach, who might be able to help the athlete maximize something in that data, what's the decision-making process like, and what do you advise your users?
I think there's a huge advantage to having a professional, sports scientist who really understands and can interpret the metrics and apply them in a meaningful way toward training, whether it's, modulating, volume and intensity, or if it's helping the athlete understand how to get better sleep so they can recover faster. The data is really powerful. So being able to share it with a professional I think is important. But there needs to be that trust there, to all of David's points. It's, in that data in the wrong hands can be used against the athlete. There's no question about that. So it's really important that the person who is working with you and working with your data understands what those boundaries are, and there's frankly a legal contract in place to protect the athlete. I think it's really important. So I think from our standpoint, it's the athlete is the one to who is the primary driver in where the data goes and who it gets shared with. So we really ensure that those boundaries are in place and that the athlete is consenting in terms of where their data goes. So I think that's first and foremost.
There are obviously many different ways to collect some of this advanced data, whether it's a timing system, it's a sensor on your wrist. Increasingly, there's markerless motion capture that, in many ways, these are camera systems that the athlete doesn't necessarily even, like, there could be on the field of play, and these systems can be set up. Maybe starting with David, where do you draw the line between sort of like the on-body monitoring versus external camera monitoring? Should there be a distinction between some of these tracking data, the data sets, and the privacy thereof?
Well, yes. I mean, there should be a distinction. I mean, I would not surprisingly argue that no matter what the data is, as long as it's coming from a player should have a say in how it's used. But there's definitely a difference between your heart rate versus GPS, for example. Your heart rate that's close to health data, right? Things that traditionally that was shared between you and your healthcare provider and perhaps your family. And now, because of science, we've learned that there's a value of this data when it comes to performance, and then it applies to professional athletes. GPS really, it's really an advanced version of someone in the stands taking a pencil and drawing on a little diagram where they think a player is. Obviously, it's 1,000 times more accurate, but it was never something that was that was private, or there were privacy issues behind it. So there definitely is a difference. I think that when you get to the level of monetization, so you're getting to the point of whichever data set it is, if someone is using it to potentially make money off of, then I think the argument shifts back to the players and saying no matter what it is, the players are the product. They are creating the labor that the data is based off of. So therefore, they should have some say in its use and application.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And speaking of the monetization potential of data, Whoop has a partnership with the NFLPA. As far as I haven't, maybe I missed it. There hasn't been too much that I know of that's been used for monetization from that just yet, but the potential remains there. Is there, what are those discussions with the NFLPA like, Kristen? And what could you see in the future?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely just still a concept, right? Just this idea that biometric data can be incorporated into betting, where fans are betting on it, or using that data in aggregate to bet on a team. I think that there is definitely the potential there, but we just haven't figured out actually how to commercialize it. But I think there is a world there though where you have an individual athlete who decides that they want to put their data out there to be bet on, and they get a cut of it. I think there is that world. You can imagine seeing heart rate data or recovery data leading into a game. You can see heart rate data as a pro golfer approaches a putt, and fans betting on it in real time based on some of that biometric feedback. So I think there's a lot of scenarios where that could where it could happen, or where it makes sense. I think looking at an offensive lines recovery versus a defensive lines recovery, and being able to kind of make bets on that, and having tons of baseline data and historical data on individuals and teams, and it just kind of adds a whole nother kind of exciting, interesting layer to the whole betting landscape. So I think there is a future where biometric data is incorporated in some way, but I think we need to figure out how the athlete is protected, and frankly how they can make money from it. Mm-hmm. I think if we can solve those two things, then there's a possibility.
Two small things, right?
Yeah.
There's certainly a difference in scale when you talk about some of the professional salaries across the different sports leagues. And Australian rugby, for instance, is one where they have found some way to monetize the data, and they've got some. I don't think it's for betting purposes, but for sponsorship during the broadcast. And I remember a few years ago there was a major rugby match where a player was attempting their equivalent of a field goal to win a big match at the end of the game, and his heart rate was live on air as he attempted the kick. Yes. And amazingly, whereas I would have been shooting through the roof, he actually lowered his to the lowest it had been all game because he was such a well-trained, conditioned athlete, made the kick. And then it turns out he also had a major shoulder injury and couldn't play again for months. And so it's just, you learn to appreciate athletes a lot more in this regard. What is the other marketing, where is the potential for an athlete to step forward? I mean, is there what kind of marketing potential can there be, and what are the pratfalls, the flip side to it? I know, David, we talked a little bit in advance on the subject. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, so I mean, there are plenty of opportunities. I think you could actually separate it between off field and off court and on court. So, for example, on court you have obviously everything they're doing on the court, and then their biometric data as it corresponds to that. And then during the when they're not playing, or even during the off season, how they're training, right? So I think equally as interesting to some people would be the workout regimens that athletes are going through, and how strenuous they are, right? So if athletes are really interested in revealing everything, then yeah, people would be interested to click a button and see how hard X player was training in the off season, or if you're an up and coming athlete and you want to compare your workout regimen to those of the professionals, and you have the ability to see what their heart rate is at the 40, what their recovery time is, their accelerations, their decelerations, how much sleep they're getting. I'm sure there are lots of people that would be interested in it. So I think that the applications are endless. I just think that, as we talked earlier, there are a couple significant educational pieces and just perhaps even like ethical concerns that everyone needs to be aware of and come to the table and figure out some technical solutions.
And Mike,
I'm gonna get my sleep plug in real quick, because there is a linear relationship between sleep and injury. So if we want to predict who's going to be available over the course of the season, how they sleep, what their baseline looks like, that's what I would bet on.
I would respectfully debate that a little bit.
Oh, yeah, you would, Princeton person. No one
and
sleeps
as
on
the father of 2 young children, I would hope the sleep isn't too profound an effect, because it's in short supply for a lot of the athletes as well who have young families.
We'll save that for another panel, but a lot of data to back that up.
David was just talking about off-season workouts and the interest that people might have. I can certainly envision an NFL player working out of the complex, with the Zybeck equipment around and doing that same sort of thing. What other areas do you see, for applying the data that your system is collecting?
Well, there's a lot of other areas. One is just the straight speed an athlete can go, but the other aspects of it are really incorporate the weight of the athlete and their power output. There's a lot of just basic physics type of parameters that can be gathered from both the weight of the athlete, how fast they run, how high they jump, and really integrating that together into, one, just baselining the athlete, but, secondly, how do they get better? And of course, the other thing that we really haven't touched on is just being able to use the data from all this to establish a baseline for pre and post injury recovery. We see it all the time, like when the draft is coming up, they'll be on the air or something on the news and saying, yep, they're looking at player X. I want to make sure he's recovered from an injury that he got a sophomore year. And, agents are looking at that, coaches are looking at that, but how do you really know they've recovered? And how do you know if you don't have anything to start with and anything to stop with? That's where just having, in all of these discussions right here, having something that's a standard data platform that no one's going to really argue about, what is sleep and, how high, that thing, having the standardization to show where you are right now, where you want to be. And if you do get injured, where you got to get back to. Because now that provides, the baseline for everybody to, to show where they are right now, where they want to be.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of baselines, the other great wearable story, it's odd that as a sport techie reporter, I now have a series of great wearable stories. But the fact that Lawson Craddock, the Tour de France cyclist, was willing to publish his data while competing in the Tour de France, I think it was last year, and he knew. He even pointed out he ended up breaking his collarbone in the first stage and was able to show that, hey, my resting heart rate baseline is usually such and such, but you could see how my body was recovering and how much more of a struggle the rest of the completing the tour was, because he actually completed the Tour de France with a broken collarbone. You could sort of see that discrepancy, and that's obviously an extreme example. But what are some of those other baselines that you encourage athletes to look for?
Well, definitely, heart rate variability is a really important marker. It's, one of the best estimators of kind of physical and, mental readiness or wellness. So I think that's a really important marker to be tracking, constantly, and to kind of, I think looking at it in snapshots is not as valuable as looking at it as a trend. But that's an important biomarker to be tracking, and I think one that, as it becomes more mainstream and folks start to understand what that really means in terms of performance levels and capacity, I think that's one that could surface as a really cool talking point in terms of just programming content and something broadcasters can talk about. So I think having athlete HRV accessible is a really cool metric to be discussing. And I thought we saw that with Lawson Craddock, how his after his injury, there was a huge suppression in his heart rate variability, right, which means his capacity is just not going to be near what it was, the day prior when he wasn't injured, right? But you could see it actually climb as he, took control, did everything he could to kind of restore and rejuvenate, extending his sleep, having, taking supplements and, hydration and all the things that he would have been doing probably anyway. He's amplifying those efforts, in an attempt to kind of recover faster. So, and you could kind of see that reflected in his heart rate variability. So I think that's one marker that, hopefully will be mainstream at some point, because it is really interesting and it is a true reflection of someone's capacity, both mental and physical.
Mm-hmm. David, do you use any device when you do your Ironman training?
I actually use just a heart rate monitor. I mean, heart rate monitor for me, and then a power meter for my biking. Mm-hmm. So I actually look. I was joking around, but I'm definitely a believer in sleep. I've seen it myself in terms of, just simply the more sleep you get, the more energized you are. So just a simple thing like that. I do follow Whoop and Oura Ring, and I'm interested in what they have to, what they show. Obviously, I know a little bit more than the average person because I know I've read some of the studies. So it all works. For me, my Ironman stuff, really, it's more a matter of I just got to get out there and run and bike and swim as much as I can.
When it comes to the discussions at the NBPA, what are, where are some of, how close are we to maybe having a device that's allowed in game, and what are some of the other big topics that you see coming down the line in the next few years?
Well, what's interesting, that is a big topic in game use, obviously, from both perspectives, from the player health and safety, and from the monetization. That's kind of the holy grail, because all the trainers will say, well, we can't properly create workouts when we don't have the data from the most strenuous time, which is when they're playing a game, right? And then obviously in terms of monetization, that's the data that everyone really wants to see. But it goes back to what we've been talking about this entire time, is who's going to own the data, how it's going to be monetized, and then just even going forward. So I'll give you an example. If you're a player and you say, okay, team, you get to, I'm going to wear this in game. What happens when I get traded? Does the team get to keep the data? Do they have to destroy it? What happens when I retire? Right? Does the team get to keep it? So if you're on the team end, obviously you want it. You want to keep it forever, because presumably you're going to use it to maybe help with future drafts, right? I now have this data from 5 years of some of my best players. I'm potentially going to compare that to the data of the incoming rookies, right? But if you're a player, why do you necessarily want a team to be able to use your data after you've retired? Or if you didn't leave on great terms with the team, the last thing you want is that team to be able to use your data against you when the next time you play them. So when there are a lot of little issues that still need to be ironed out. But we're, like I said, we continue to educate each other. We continue to learn more about the data, more about how it can be used. So we're making progress on the information front. Obviously, when you add the issue of gambling, and then you add on top of that the issue of COVID and how COVID has impacted revenue everywhere. Now that potential money based on certain agreements and based on what state's doing, if that money can trickle down to the teams and to the players. Now maybe it's a little bit more enticing if the original revenue projections are no longer what they're supposed to be. All that's very speculative, but you can see how, based on what's going on in society, that might slow down or speed up the push to use data in many forms.
Mm-hmm. And Christian, I know Whoop is approved for MLB games. In my own asking around, I haven't found too many, if any, really that do that. But where do you see Whoop as a potential device for in competition use?
Yeah, we're approved for in-game use in MLB actually. So we have a ton of athletes, MLB athletes, who wear it in-game.
Really?
So yeah, we actually have a lot of in-game baseball data, which has been really cool. We probably have over half of NHL wearing it in-game too. So they're not supposed to. And then we have a lot of NBA athletes who just tape it up and wear it during games as well. A few of those athletes have been fined because they've been found out. But yeah, I mean, I think to David's point earlier, like, it's really hard to understand how, like, if you don't have your in-game data, right, where there's massive amounts of load incurring, like there's lots of stress, right? When you take that data out, and now you've only got the other 22 hours that you're looking at, you're kind of pulling out like kind of an important piece, right? That's going to influence your capacity for tomorrow. So I think, depriving that of the athlete is a little criminal in my view, when you're trying to like calibrate your life around some of these data points and take steps to really, amplify recovery efforts, but not having kind of that in-game load data, I think is, it's just a missed opportunity, right? Because we could be leveraging that information and that insight to help understand what we need to do the other, 20 hours of the day to really improve our chances to, recover, optimally for the next day. So, yeah, I mean, I think we should be allowing athletes to have in-game physiological data. I mean, that's just seems crazy to me that we don't, and totally not in the best interest of the athlete. If they want to wear it, like there's no reason why they shouldn't.
That's broker deal right here.
Yeah, I'm ready.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we're running out of time, but thank you very much to Kristen, to Mike, to David. We appreciate all your time and insights, and hope we could continue this down the road.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Joe.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Mike. It's fun.